Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I am your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, I have just an amazing conversation with Steve Rio, who runs Enfold.org, which is up in the greater Vancouver area of Canada. And we just had a fantastic conversation the other week about his practice of working with clients with vaporized 5-MeO and also injectable 5-MeO DMT. And at the conclusion of our interview, I'm very pleased to share that Steve proclaimed that this was the most sophisticated conversation he's ever had about 5-MeO DMT on a podcast. So I'm really happy to bring this conversation to you, the listening audience, today. But first, we're just going to get a few announcements out of the way before we get there, okay? All right, let's do some announcements. Not too much to announce today. I do want to share with you, the listening audience, that there is a new interview with me that is now out there and available for your listening and viewing pleasure. It's a rather long interview. It's about 2.5 hours long, and it's on the Huki and Flameus show. And I've got that posted over at my Patreon page at patreon.com/MartinWBall. It's up there for free. You don't have to be a paying member at Patreon to find that on my Patreon page. So that's the fastest route that I'd point you towards to go find that interview. But really enjoyed that conversation with Huki, also known as Helgi, and Flameus. And thanks to both of them for inviting me for that very interesting and spirited discussion and conversation, which covers a lot of territory of 5-MeO DMT, non-duality, metaphysics, ontology, epistemology. It's got the works. It's got it all. So I encourage you to check that out. Of course, if you would like to be a supporting member of this podcast, then I do invite you to go to my Patreon page, patreon.com/MartinWBall, and sign up at a paying tier that is something that works for you. There's everything from $1 a month, which is the basic minimum, and all the way up to $100 a month. And as you go up those tiers, you get increasing access, benefits, and bonuses. Anything above the $20 a month level and up gets you access to the full back catalog of the Entheogenic Evolution archive with hundreds of interviews and talks that are no longer publicly available here on the podcast due to storage limitations. And of course, at the top tiers, you get either a 30-minute monthly call with me or a 60-minute monthly video call with me to help you integrate your experiences, provide you with reflection, support, whatever it is that you need, or just want to shoot the breeze and talk for a while. And of course, as always, I'm available for 30, 60, or 90-minute video calls to help you integrate your entheogenic experience from a non-dual and energetic perspective. I do specialize in 5-MeO DMT, but I'm not limited to that in any way, shape, or form. If you'd like more information, just reach out, send me an email at martinwball@gmail.com, stop by at martinball.net, or nondualentheogenicintegration.com, and that will get you more info for my services there. Okay, that's all I have to share for this week. Again, my guest is Steve Rio. His website is enfold.org. There will be a link to that in the podcast notes. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into this conversation. It's about an hour and a half long. I hope you enjoy it. I certainly enjoyed having this conversation with Steve, and it's fascinating to continue the conversation here on the podcast about injectable 5-MeO DMT. And just a quick reminder to all the listeners, that's only something you can do with the pure molecule of 5-MeO DMT. It must be extremely pure, must be made in a lab, and it absolutely should not ever, 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 ever come from a toad. All right, here's my conversation with Steve Rio. Please enjoy. Well, I am excited to welcome on to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today, Steve Rio, who is joining me from a treadmill in Vancouver, Canada. You're in Vancouver, right? I got that right?
Yeah, we're on Bowen Island, just outside of Vancouver, yes.
Okay. So in the greater Vancouver metropolitan area, we've been talking about having this conversation for a while, but now we are finally here. So Steve Rio is... You correct me if I'm wrong, one of the founders of Enfold in the Vancouver area, which provides a few different modalities of experiencing 5-MeO DMT, and we're going to be talking all about it today. So, Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, honored to be here.
Yeah. So, let's start with the place that I always start with anybody who's a new guest onto the podcast, is inviting you to kind of introduce yourself and kind of share your story with the podcast listening audience. And so, the typical place to start is, how did you get into the world of psychedelic medicines? What brought you into this? Then we'll, turn specifically to what is offered at Enfold and your work with 5-MeO and all of that. But let's start with you.
Yeah, psychedelics started for me in my teens with, I feel like I got really lucky in that I had a small group of friends and we somehow figured out how to be very intentional around the use of mushrooms. And we had some really, we had a lot of really beautiful experiences sitting in a circle and exploring mushrooms and talking about life and being out in nature. And those experiences really shaped the way I see the world. And so those were my first experiences. And that through my early 20s was really transformative. And then, it's interestingly, around my mid-20s or something like that, I stopped all psychedelics for about a decade. And I think I got really serious. I think my ego took over, actually. I think I got afraid to dip into these spaces. I went through a phase where I had to get my shit together, quote unquote, and had to grow up or something like that. And so that was a period of my life. And then when we moved to Bowen Island, where we live and work now, back in 2016, that was the spark of psychedelics coming back into our life in a major way, both personally and professionally. We started professionally working with psychedelics in 2019, but leading that 2016 to 2019 was a big re-entry into psychedelics, both personally and exploring different things and starting to think about this work. And it was really the property we moved to was really interesting because we looked at all these different places, and this place was set up. I mean, we've done a lot of work, but it was kind of the beginning of what Enfold is now. And I don't know that we would have been doing this at this phase of our life, actually, if this property hadn't happened in the way it did. So it was really interesting how it just kind of unfolded that way.
Oh, unfolded.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a big shift to get into moving from personal exploration with mushrooms, taking time off for a decade for psychedelics, then actually getting into serving and facilitating others. Yeah. What inspired that return and that idea of actually serving and facilitating others in this kind of context?
Yeah, I think all through that period, basically in my mid-20s, I started exploring basically healing and personal development outside of the psychedelic realm. So I did my first attachment theory workshop when I was 26. And that totally opened up this world to me of understanding, starting to understand psychology and explore psychology. And I've been I'd say a student. I'm 45 now. So for the last 20 years, I'd say that's been a major part of my life, is working to understand myself and others better through the lens of psychology and spirituality. I would say spirituality had this strong pulse in my early life. And then there was a period where I would say I didn't feel connected spiritually, but that's what came back. And the connection of those two was what led to doing this work. So yeah, my background, while I wasn't kind of heavily involved in psychedelics, I was doing a ton of different trainings and workshops and reading and all this stuff in the realms of psychology, and then into transpersonal psychology. And my wife's work was really focused around intimacy and different forms of therapy and holistic health. So it was like this interesting blending of all of our interests and skill sets and where I think our zones of genius are, and kind of came together to do what we do. It's sort of interesting that it was like a spark out of nowhere, and it's everything we've ever worked on in our lives coming together,
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like a nice meshing of interests and trajectories there.
Yeah, for sure.
How did you first become aware of 5-MeO, and how did that first introduce itself to you or you to it?
Yeah. Our first experience was through a friend, and he basically had been saying, you got to come try this. You got to come try this. You got to come try this. And it took a little while to say yes. And, like this was back in 2016, 17 as well, basically right around that same time frame. And as you know, there wasn't a lot of information out at that time on the internet. Were you publishing by then?
Yeah.
You were publishing through that time, like your work, but there was kind of like, there wasn't a lot of solid information on 5-MeO DMT. It wasn't easy to find, at least from somebody who was outside of the realm.
Right.
And I don't think I found your work for another couple of years, but he just said, you got to come try this. We ended up having our first experience in sort of what seems like a pretty typical fashion, where you show up somewhere, you meet the person who's about to serve you medicine, you get served, and then you bounce out of there 2 hours later. And both my wife and I have a pretty strong history of meditation and, like I say, psychedelic work and other things. So we have a pretty good foundation for the experience. We've both done 10-day silent retreats. And so it was a wild magnitude of experience to process, but I felt like we had a pretty good foundation to do so on our own, because essentially that's what we were offered. Interestingly, I had a few friends doing it that day as well, and they were really disoriented. So we kind of rounded them all up and brought them back to our place and made them a meal and talked about the experience and started integrating, this experience that we were still integrating as well. And that was our first experience.
Yeah. So that's kind of the older style of 5-MeO facilitation, where, at that time period, essentially no one was focused on preparation and information, properly educating people about even what is the 5-MeO experience. Like your description is very typical, where we had like these 5-MeO shamans going around, and then you just show up, like, okay, you're next, you get your hit, and then move on to the next person, and then, you go home. So where we are currently, like I teach with Mindscape Psychedelic Institute, and we've got like a 5 to 6 month program about educating people about how to do preparation and screening, how to do facilitation, how to do integration. So it's grown quite a bit in that area. But during the early years of public awareness around 5-MeO, definitely it was very much more of, I would just say, very less professional than it is today in many contexts. And you're also very lucky that you're in Canada, where 5-MeO has not been scheduled as an illegal substance. So I think it makes it a lot easier to provide above ground work that, I think when things are kept in the dark, that's when, the most problems tend to arise.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting that I think so for us, we worked privately for the first, we launched our website in 2023. So we kind of announced ourselves to the world in 2023, but we had been working since 2019, and we were all referral based and word of mouth. And I think I went on a couple podcasts, but we were pretty underground, I would say. Yeah. And then in 2023, leading up to 2023, that's when we decided that a big part of our work was not just to do this at a very high level, but to also help to set standards, help to educate like you are, and help to raise awareness around best practices for this medicine. Because as much as folks like you are doing what you're doing, and there's some good things happening, I would say still the majority of people experiencing 5-MeO are experiencing it in these one-off settings with very little preparation or support. And like we hear from people all the time in that spectrum. And so I think, it's interesting. 5-MeO has no lineage in the sense of some of the other medicines, which is a blessing. I think a really beautiful opportunity to look at something from a more modern perspective, but also it comes with the hindrance of people not having the same respect for it. Like in Canada, you can buy 5-MeO vape pens at the mushroom shops downtown and online, and they're kind of everywhere, and people are just popping up with vape pens. And I don't know. It's funny. I'm pretty liberal with psychedelics in general, but with 5-MeO, I'm less liberal.
Yeah, well,
If that makes sense.
it's understandable because I mean, one of the things I always communicate to people around 5-MeO who are kind of curious about it is that I like to let them know, like, even a small dose of 5-MeO is probably going to present as a stronger, more powerful psychedelic experience than you've ever really had before, even if it's only a couple minutes long.
Yeah.
Even at a small dose, and that it is not something that I ever recommend. You know, people ask me like, "Well, can I just get some and work on my own?" It's like, no, please don't. Please don't just go get some and
Yeah.
try working with it, because as you and I both know, especially once we go up the dose scale, people are entering into states where they don't have conscious control over their bodies. They lose awareness of the exterior world. And sometimes people will lie there perfectly quietly and peacefully and nothing happens. And then other times, as we know, they're going to be moving all over the place, doing somersaults, stripping off their clothes, or whatever it is that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not something to be taken casually. And I totally agree with you that I like the fact that there isn't any kind of established tradition around 5-MeO, so that it allows for a lot of experimentation and a lot of exploration, and kind of open that question of what are best practices? What is this even good for?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not coming with that sense of, well, we've got to do what people have always done with it. But then that also, again, it leaves it with this idea for a lot of people. They think, oh, it's so easy. You just like hand somebody the pipe or hand somebody the vaporizer, and then you just watch over them for, 10, 15, 20, 30, however many minutes. And that's all
Yeah.
that there is. But you and I both know I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, 100%. I say the same thing all the time. I feel like so many people think that this is the easy. I think a lot of people, maybe for good reasons, or maybe, or maybe for, generally altruistic reasons, or maybe for more egoic reasons, want to be able to provide a big experience to someone, or to, to do that. And sitting with someone for 5 hours with mushrooms, or 8 hours with LSD, or whatever with ayahuasca, is a lot of, is a seemingly lot of work, and then there's a higher barrier entry. But I think there's this perception that 5-MeO has a very low barrier to entry in terms of serving it. Like, I just, hold the pen up and sit with you for 15 minutes, and then you trauma bond to me, or you have this attachment to me after. And so there's just a ton of people serving 5 that really shouldn't be. And then it's so interesting that we are working with the strongest psychedelic on the planet. It has this when you're vaporizing, at least, this incredibly short window. So, and this incredibly easy way of serving it, and it kind of has like no friction in terms of serving it, and so much potential friction in terms of integrating it.
Yeah.
And so it's a really funny thing that the universe presented us with this one.
Yeah. Yeah. It is somewhat paradoxical because, and I'm sure as you know, that for people who are at the place where they are authentically ready to let go and dissolve within the experience, generally it goes quite beautifully, and it does seem very, very simple. It's like, all you need to do is just lie back, and there you go. And then your ego comes back and you say, oh my God, that was the most profound experience ever. I'm so grateful. But that's just in the, quote, best case scenario. And what I always like to say with people who are curious about 5-MeO is that we never know where you actually are at on the ability to release scale until you get to the moment where you actually have that full release dose. And so and the language I use is that first full release dose, I like to call that the diagnostic round. Because at the surface level, everyone's going to say, well, yeah, of course I want to let go. Of course I want to dissolve into infinite love. Like, I mean, who wouldn't? But the reality is that there are all different ways that the ego can hold on or resist or have trauma and things that it needs to process that the individual person is not aware of at the conscious level. And the 5-MeO is going to expose that. But we don't know really until we get there, and then the event happens. And so it's just, it's a misnomer if people think, oh, it's just so easy and it's just going to be beautiful and blissful. Like we certainly hope for that. But another thing I always like to say is that, look, results vary. And again, we don't know until we actually get there. And, we can do work with doing screening and asking people questions and having them fill out questionnaires. But even then, we're still mostly going to get what the story that the ego wants to communicate, which isn't necessarily the truth. And it's not to say that people are lying. It's just to say that people have different levels of awareness about what's actually going on inside them.
Yeah, I actually think probably what's more helpful is to do away with the idea that the objective or the goal line, maybe not, that's probably not what as I would say. I guess do away with the idea that the white light pure unity experience is the most common, because it's not. It's beautiful when it happens. And I was lucky enough that my first experience was that. It was just exceptional. And but I would say as I get more experienced with working with this medicine, and as we get more experience with serving people, that is less and less of the focus. In fact, a lot of our discovery process to decide, like, to help people decide if they're ready to come see us, is to make sure that they're clear. Like, this isn't a white light experience you're buying. It may be, but that's about a 20% chance. There's an 80% chance you have a very, very challenging experience that will be incredibly useful if you are oriented towards it, you have the right context and the right support for it. And it is on the path to feeling that love for yourself and that love for everyone else. Is like, it's all part of that process. But to do away with the idea that that's what you're seeking is the first step, I think.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I think that is just so important. Because just reflecting on what you shared about yourself, that for me, my very first experience with 5-MeO was the pure God, absolute unconditional love experience. It was the most amazing thing that had ever happened to me. And it just presented as, okay, this is definitely what I've been looking for my entire life. And from my own personal experience, my initial conclusion was, I don't think anything could be easier than 5-MeO, because it was so easy, right? I took the hit and within seconds, like, oh my God, like, this is it. And then it wasn't until afterwards that I had the opportunity to observe more people, and then really quickly realize, like, oh, I think the experience I had, I'm comfortable saying that that's like the highest potential of the experience, but it's not the automatic response by any means. And that there's such a wide variety here. And so that we really need to understand, what I like to say is, all the different ways that the energy of the ego at both the unconscious and unconscious levels may or may not interact with or resist that infinite energetic expansion that happens with 5-MeO. And that, as you say, it actually gives us a lot of rich material to work with. And as we let go of the desire for, I would just want to go into the white light and bliss, but rather look at it as, this potentially is going to show me all the places I'm getting in my own way, and maybe have held on to wounds or traumas that are not serving me. So it's really, I always emphasize the idea of working with 5-MeO is going to supercharge an energetic recalibration process. But that's the key phrase, is it's a process. It's not just about, oh, did you have a good experience or not? It's about, are we engaging in the process? Yeah.
100%. Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that. And it's interesting as thinking about my personal work, as I've become more experienced, my sessions with 5-MeO would be, measured as much more challenging than any of my first experiences, only because I know where to excavate. And it's, for me, I don't find it, I find it amazing, but like the way you'd measure it in some scientific scale, it would probably be a 10 out of 10 on challenging experiences, facing the deepest shame, generational shame of all my father and lineage or something like that. And feeling that pain through the energy of the body and releasing that energy and working with that and all those kind of layers. And, but that's actually the work, is to realign energetically and to clear that cellular muck, essentially, and so that we can feel more present and more awakened in our day-to-day life, right?
Yeah, I'd love to just re-emphasize something that you just mentioned there, because this is something that I communicate with a lot of people as well. That I like to say that there tend to be two different generic trajectories that people take in their 5-MeO process and experience. And one is people like you and I, whose very first experience we would say, yeah, that was the full package, amazing, blissful.
Yeah.
And then after that, it can be confusing for people, because if they go back and they do it again and they say, well, now it's like dredging up all my shit. Like, what's that about? Like, I just want to get back to that beautiful white light experience. And so I like to advise people that often after, if you've had the full release experience, it will often become more personal and more targeted and more nuanced, and therefore actually more challenging to the ego, because just getting back to the white light is kind of worthless if you're not actually transforming yourself. And so that's where the quote, the work is. And then for other people, they might have to go through kind of an extensive process of unloading, unpacking, releasing, and transforming. And then eventually everything lets go and they go into the white light, the pure love. That's very generic, but that helping people understand, again, that it's a process. It's not just about that beautiful non-dual experience, but it's about the way that we are allowing ourselves to encounter and engage with all the hidden subterranean areas of our energy, so that we can actually reach a point where we can just say, hey, I'm present and authentic with what is. That's really where the gift is. It's the transformation that it brings about, and it's not just about singular, beautiful, amazing, mind-blowing experiences.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. I totally agree.
We're on the same page.
No, it is. It's an interesting thing when, I guess the two things that happen is, one is that folks like you and I, who our first experience is that white light experience, is probably why we do this work. It's probably how we got into it, because because of that first experience. So I think there's something to be said. Like, I think if my first experience was harrowing and super hardcore, I may have done it again, but I probably wouldn't have had the instinct like, hey, maybe I could do this with people. Right. So I think there's something to be said about, and you kind of see the truest potential of this medicine, of what it can unlock and present to you. And so it kind of presents that pathway. But it's also interesting that a lot of people who want to talk about 5-MeO are the ones who have the white light experiences. And so it's the majority of what a lot of people hear is that, because it's a much sexier conversation to go on YouTube and make a video about how you saw God than to see how you saw all the shitty flaws in your personality, right? Like, and how you've been trying to unpack, like, the fact that you can now see your psyche in such a distinct, like such a brutally honest way that's like really hard to function for a couple of months or something like that. Like, a lot of the other things that happen with this medicine is a lot less. It's far more nuanced. It's far more complicated, and it's not as sexy to talk about.
Yeah, and kind of going back to a point that was made earlier, that oftentimes I think it is the people who have had a really positive experience that they want to jump maybe prematurely into the role of facilitating, and this is where I see a lot of facilitators in the modality that I'm getting integration clients from a wide variety of people who facilitate 5-MeO, you guys included. And it's not at all uncommon for one of my integration clients to come and tell me, like, I had this really difficult time, but the person who facilitated for me insisted that people only have beautiful, positive experiences, and that they've never seen someone have a difficult time like myself. And usually when they describe their case, my initial response is, everything you just told me is completely normal. And I'm sorry that your facilitator either was uneducated around this, or maybe even oversold you on what would be a beautiful, amazing experience, because it's not the automatic response. And
not at all.
Yeah, I think that your assessment that maybe 20% of people, I think that that's probably a pretty good estimate of like who's really going to have like the full quote unquote white light, beautiful experience. But being human is hard, and
man,
it's not easy. And the thing that I always like to say about 5-MeO is that it has the potential to find anywhere within yourself that there's some kind of pain or resistance, and it can interact with any aspect of your life from your very first moment up until the very second that you're taking that hit. And so it's like your entire life is fair game within the 5-MeO experience and your relationship to the totality of yourself. So this is monumental, but that's also why it's so effective as a transformative tool, because there's nowhere to hide. And
that's right. We say that all the time. I think it's like the most effective tool in the drawer for if somebody is really, really understands what you just said, that there is nowhere to hide in this medicine. So are you really ready to see things at a level of clarity that you can't undo? And maybe you could say that to some degree about most psychedelics. There's varying levels of that for sure, but 5-MeO pierces in a way that nothing else does. And it also pierces into the nervous system, into the energy body, into the deepest unconscious, pre-verbal, all the stuff. Like anything that's in there is going to potentially be unlocked. And it may reveal itself in the session itself, or it may present itself in the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, right? So we always also prepare people for the idea that when you come to see us and the depth that we're going to go with you and all the steps that we take to make sure that we can get to the kind of just as deep as we can get into the cave on when we get to that full release moment, is you should expect it to be a 6 to 12 month process that you're then entering into. And it's not going to be, for some, it's going to be very acute for a number of months. Actually, it's going to be quite challenging for a couple of months. And for others, it may not be acutely challenging, but you're going to be seeing things differently, and there's going to be work there, and you can suppress that if you really wanted to, but it's not a pleasant experience to. So I think it's like this. It's like this incredibly. That's I think why we both were sort of saying like I'm more liberal about almost everybody doing mushrooms, but I'm much less. I think for 5-MeO, it's like at the right time, with the right context, with the right buy-in to what you're about to do, right? Like then I think I think it's amazing.
Yeah. And just to reiterate that point that you just made, because I think this is another just a vital part of education around 5-MeO, is that yes, the experience itself is relatively brief, but the impact and the energetic processing that's going to take place can potentially last for many, many months afterwards. And a lot of the effects that we can get from 5-MeO for people often don't even show up for maybe even several days. So it can be even misleading to like, oh, well, I did this on Saturday, Sunday, I'm feeling great, Monday, I'm feeling great. And then all of a sudden Tuesday is like, oh my goodness, my deepest, darkest fears are suddenly present and I'm filled with anxiety. And that the energetic repercussions of the 5-MeO just keep playing out for people. So it's just important for people to understand. This is why I'm so big on education around it. It's like, I want people to know what they're getting into before they take their hit. I want them to be facilitated well by people who know what they're doing and are able to meet people with whatever arises, and then also have strong support and education around what happens next. And that this is also a place where I just think that because 5-MeO is so uniquely energetically powerful, that we also get a rather unique collection of effects that happen that just at a level that we don't see with mushrooms or ayahuasca or MDMA or really anything else. And so that's why I'm always trying to promote this idea that we need to understand and approach 5-MeO DMT as something that is sui generis, something that is uniquely unique. Even though it fits within the world of psychedelics, it's still so different and unique that we need a completely 5-MeO tailored approach to introducing people to it, working with it, and then integrating and letting all that land and actually transform post-session.
Yeah, I totally agree. 5-MeO seems to be, as far as I've experienced, the only substance on the planet that works at the level of nervous system and energy, the way that it does. And that's the major differentiator as far as I can tell. Like there's the whole psychological aspect of it and the non-dual reckoning and all those pieces. But there's this element of being able to pierce into the nervous system that way, into the energy system that way, that just no other medicine does. And that's why I think you see a lot of the effects coming on a week later, or it takes a while for that like we always tell our guests on the last day, it's a 5-day process that we lead in person with a 3-week preparation and a multi-week integration. But on the last day, we say, we want to reiterate, you don't know what's happened yet. And it's going to keep coming up. So just to be as aware and to create space for that, be sensitive to that. And it's not bad, or it's not nothing. It's actually a good sign if you have fear energy come up or these other pulses coming through you and you can't really place them. It's like, oh, I'm suddenly feeling all this fear and I don't have any rational reason for it. Why am I feeling so fearful? Well, that's energy that's been stuck in your system for a very long time, finally surfacing. And depending on the person's background and psychological profile and energetic imprint and all these things, that process can often, like the acute phase of that process can for sure be a couple of weeks, if not longer. I mean, in extreme cases, it can be quite a bit longer, but in most cases, I would say the acute phase seems to last a maximum of about 2 weeks, but it can be a lot of energy purging essentially, or processing. And it's not a linear thing. It's not a psychological thing. So it can be really hard to rationalize. You know, you have to have a pretty different paradigm shift in order to not feel like you're going nuts, because the psychological world wants to immediately pathologize it or label it or call it something or have a reason for it, other than that's just energy that's been stuck in a pipe for a long time and it's finally moving and it's finally coming through you, you know?
Yeah. And it's a very difficult reorientation, even for people in the psychedelic world, because there's so much emphasis on sort of this psychological approach, especially when psychedelics are being used therapeutically. The idea that where you're going to set your intentions, then you're going to keep going back to your intentions and your questions, and then you're going to look at causal relationships, and that there's kind of this emphasis on understanding. And just to highlight what you're sharing here is that with 5-MeO, with the after effects that we're getting, that's the phrase that I like to use with people all the time, is it's just energy. And it's sorting out, but that the ego is like, well, I want to identify it. I want to know the cause. I want to know the root. I want to know what's happening. I want to frame it into a story and put it into a therapeutic process, versus reorienting around the idea that through our human lives, we get a lot of unprocessed energies, emotions, and materials that are actually stuck somewhere within our being at the physical and energetic and emotional and cognitive level. And that 5-MeO has the power to bring everything to the surface and allow it the opportunity to transform. But this is where, like, people have their 5-MeO experience and they say, well, then I've been crying for the past 2 weeks now, but I don't know what I'm crying about. And that's really uncomfortable for the ego, because the ego wants to know, well, I'm crying about the way that my dad beat me, right? That's because then the ego says, I can identify it and I'm putting it into a story and it makes meaning, and therefore I feel comforted by that. But this is usually more like, no, I'm just crying and I can't identify why. Or as you say, I'm feeling fear. I can't identify why. It's like, well, this is energy sorting itself out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the ego structures its understanding and story. So it can be, it can be helpful to find some way of attaching a story to it, but it's not actually the thing that is going to relieve you of the underlying patterns that are affecting your life. It's actually just moving through that energy. Yeah. That's what's going to create the change. And I think the storytelling and the psychological, I was going to use a weird word that doesn't exist, but the psychology aspect of it, I think it's just helpful to keep the brain and the ego on board with your process. Right. So, and I wanted to just touch on something. You used the word earlier, and this is something we've started introducing as a way of thinking about 5 that's different than other psychedelics, is that coming out of the experience, we think of the first few weeks at least, and for some people longer, as not necessarily an integration phase yet, but a recalibration phase. And you use the word recalibration. Yeah. And I haven't actually heard anybody else use that term. And I don't know if you're using it in the same context. I'd be curious. But for us, there's like this there's this massive somatic or energetic shift that can take place. The mind may or may not have been caught up on any of that yet, right? So the mind is sort of running an old set of software on new hardware, on a hardware that has shifted, and it's trying to, and there's you need to reconnect the dots. And there may be some old pattern that says, I get anxious in this environment, but your body doesn't do that anymore. You actually aren't anxious in that because whatever that was has been cleared out, or some energy needs to move through you. And there's like this, so we think of it as like this recalibration phase of who are you now? And the only way to know who you are now is to stay really present, very aware, and to have as little preconceived notion as possible, which is very challenging for the ego, obviously, but to try and just be really open to what is emerging and how does your system feel after this experience, and to reintroduce yourself to yourself effectively. And there's kind of this recalibration, and then you can work to integrate that what has shifted.
Yeah. And I think it's a good way to look at that initial time period. So like when I have clients who say, hey, I want to book an integration call with me, I usually recommend, well, let's wait at least a few days after your session, because there's a good chance that whatever energetic reconditioning and recalibration, it's not going to show up necessarily on day one. It might be a few days out. And that really a large part of that work, especially in that 2-week window, which seems to be the most potent time period, is really about helping people trust and relax into that energetic recalibration that's taking place. And so it's not really about helping people at a cognitive level. It's not really about providing, quote, like grounding tools or practices or things like that. It's more about helping people trust that you're in a process. And so the invitation is to put your awareness into the energy and into the process, that A, you can't stop. And so B, you want to learn how to work with it. And that actually is, even though it can be very uncomfortable and challenging, that when we allow this process to move through and for these energetic events to take place, that is actually bringing us into a more grounded and integrated energetic version of ourselves. And that as we go through these changes, a lot of the old patterns or old compensation mechanisms, they're not going to work. And they also might feel acutely uncomfortable.
Yes.
And so that going with this idea that a lot of the patterns that have made up our sense of self have been embedded within us at an unconscious level because we established them when we were very small children. And then as we are adults, we are not aware of the architecture that's been constructed deep down within our being. This is now bringing all of that to the surface and allowing things that are dysfunctional to discharge. So I like to say that 5-MeO doesn't find where you're out of alignment and then just smooth it over and make you feel better and say like, oh, I feel great. Actually, what it does is it highlights like, whoa, this really makes me uncomfortable. So can I choose to let it go? And then as we become more aware of those unconscious patterns and habits, then we can choose, oh, I'm not going to engage in that cascade of reactions that normally would have just been a completely unconscious process. So it's that it's heightening that awareness, and that we as subjects moving through it want to do it as best we can in a state of trust and a state of allowance. And that might mean that we're going through big emotional events. We're going through big mental confusions, and we're going to be feeling a lot of stuff in our bodies, and that there might be a lot of embodied somatic processing that's taking place. And a lot of it feels, quote, very out of control. So it definitely could be scary for people. But that's where we just want to normalize it. Yeah. So, Steve, let's talk a little bit about the process that you guys have at Enfold. And actually, where I'd like to start is to ask you, where did you guys start? And I'm going to assume, and then you can just tell me, like, don't make assumptions, but I'm going to assume that probably your process has changed over time in terms of how you facilitate. Because, again, most people are not going through like strict training programs. So it is like this process of learning as you go and developing. But I'm curious how you guys started, and then let's kind of work our way up to what you guys are now offering with the 5-day program. And I think quite significantly the use of 5-MeO injections. But let's go with where you guys started.
Yeah. So our first experiences, like we've talked about, were these, we call it drive-by 5. That's just our term for the 2-hour session thing.
Yeah.
But our first experiences were that we had a couple of those. And we talked a lot about the different work we had done and things we had done and how that felt and what was necessary. And the first instinct was that at a minimum, let's just have people stay the night with us so they have time to decompress the experience a little bit, right? And like they don't have to just go right back. Because one of the biggest challenges I think with that, the speed of that is that you have to put your ego back together and call an Uber or get in a car, or go back home, make dinner for the kids and all that kind of stuff. So our first instinct was really, let's just make this an overnight experience, and let's provide some like basic level context for what people are walking into, so that, and at that time I would say what we understood as the context has changed dramatically from then to now, but at least it was like some of the table stakes I would say that we've discussed around what could potentially happen, how to prepare, what to maybe, some ideas of what to expect or what not to expect, and kind of helping people contextualize it. I would also say that our first attempt at all of that was far more, I think if I recall correctly, I was like trying to explain spiral dynamics to people, and spiral dynamics is like, do you know what that is?
Yeah.
But for people who don't know, it's kind of like this way of looking at consciousness and psychology and consciousness of evolution over time and in the individual. And it was all to say that I think I had a much more heady approach to what needed to be delivered in terms of information compared to what we talk about now. And basically just through trial, like through trying things out, through learning. And like, I just think, and I can't say that we did this, but I would say that until you've seen 50 ceremonies, maybe 100, you really haven't seen close to the spectrum of what can happen in a ceremony, right? But I think we did a number of work before we ever charged money. Before we ever did that, we did a lot of work. We brought in a few people to try and learn from them. Kind of did a lot of exploration, but there is no clear framework for 5-MeO, and a lot of the frameworks that we saw in other psychedelics didn't transfer in. Yeah. And we didn't want to bring in shamanics. We didn't want it like a shamanic lens. We didn't want to. Anyway, it was like, how do we create a container that allows for as spiritual experience as somebody has? Some people see it as a spiritual experience, others see it differently. But like, how do we do that without naming it or labeling it or defining what spiritual means? I think from the very beginning, it's been about really creating as clear of a container, as blank of a canvas as possible, while providing contextual and energetic support. And so the first version was like a single night. We pretty quickly moved to a 2-night so that we could do a day of integration work. And it's just steadily evolved over time. And what has also evolved is the way we actually serve the medicine. We're also working with another medicine as part of the week. We work with another medicine now as well. We're serving 5-MeO DMT in 2 different ways throughout the week. So there's been a lot of iterations and a lot of evolution. And then the other big piece that's evolved is the amount of preparation that we provide people. So now we have basically 3 weeks worth of material that they can go through on a daily basis that provides reflection and some practices to start practicing some embodiment and interoception and introducing different ways of state change and things like that. We've definitely like dramatically increased how we both screen and the amount of information we take in about people so that we have a really good context for the person. And then as our group work has evolved, we've built more ways for the group to start building cohesion ahead of getting to us. Because a huge aspect of the depth that you can go is just how safe someone feels.
Yeah.
And the more safety they have with us, with themselves, with the process, with the context of what they're doing, and with the group, just the deeper you're going to get. So
Wow.
it kind of just has been I feel like we're in the third major version of our protocol, but we're probably in the like 100th micro iteration. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right, Steve.
Oh, good.
So I just got to say that, and partly I'm actually saying this to my students because I'm definitely going to be sending my current batch of students. I'm going to be sending them the link for this interview when it comes out, because I just want to say, like, everything I've just heard from you, Steve, this is what I want to hear from 5-MeO facilitators. So there's some things that I want to highlight here. So first of all, I really liked that you made the decision to move away from over focusing on spiral dynamics. So one of the things that I like to teach my students who are either working on integration or on facilitation is I say, try not to import outside models and overemphasize that in your work with 5-MeO. And that spiral dynamics is a very interesting model of consciousness, but it may or may not really coincide with people's direct experience. So we want to avoid importing too much outside information, and that also that can tend to over-intellectualize it for people. And so I would also say that I like to encourage the same thing around spiritual models or spiritual metaphysics as well. That, for one, you're going to work with people who don't necessarily share your spiritual worldview or your beliefs or your metaphysics. And that what I love about 5-MeO is that it's a direct entry into the fullness of yourself, and that we don't need to be filling people's heads with various spiritual ideas or even psychological ideas. It's like, here, this is a radical encounter with you. So I, the person facilitating or providing integration, I don't need to be giving you a bunch of psychological data or a bunch of religious or spiritual references and memes and myths and symbolism, because this is a very direct experience. So I like that you moved away from that, and then it sounds like you started focusing on more of education around the energetics of the experience. That, again, with my students, I always say, look, let's talk about the energy. Let's talk about how energy presents and is processed in the body, in the being, in the mind, in the heart. And that's really what we want to prep people on. So that, for example, if somebody becomes aware that they have been rolling all around the room screaming, that at some point they can remember, like, oh yeah, Steve told me that this might happen, that this is a normal thing, versus sometimes I get a client who says, like, well, nobody told me that would happen. And then actually my facilitator said, well, we think maybe you're possessed, and so we've got to do an exercise.
Yeah, they bring in some crazy ideas. Like at that moment, it's such an impressionable moment, right?
Yeah. And they implant that idea, and that becomes a fear, and it becomes an obsession. So I always tell people, like, keep it as neutral as possible. If you want to talk about anything, you should be talking about energy and how it presents and how it's processed. And also, in prepping people for the experience, that I do like to recommend that facilitators kind of lay out, this is the spectrum of experience that people may have. This is the spectrum of reaction. So we can start to just normalize all of this really strange and unusual stuff that may or may not happen within the experience. Because the last thing we want is somebody to come through and feel like, I've done something wrong, I'm a freak because I screamed and threw up. And like nobody else does that. And like the facilitators are looking at me weird because I did that.
You know? Yeah. And it's so interesting because, like, if, people present as very unique and complex, and then when you see enough archetypes, you realize that the underlying fears are very, very similar and very simple, right? And one of them is, I'm different and I'm weird and I'm not acceptable, right? Like, or some variation of those three. And these experiences, if they happen the way you just described, just absolutely reinforce that and do the opposite of what you're trying to do. So yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting that we started talking about nervous system and energy work and this stuff. And actually, because it's coming back to me now, I discovered your work. We had started talking about the energy of this and realizing this is not a psychological thing so much. I mean, psychological happens and it's part of it because we're psychological beings. but this is much more an energy process than it is anything else. And then I read your work for the first time and I was like, holy shit, someone else is saying this. Someone else has said this. Like I hadn't, because I couldn't find anything. And then somebody said, you got to check out Martin Ball. And I remember, forget which book I picked up first, but I just thought, oh, finally someone sees the same thing we've been seeing here. Why is no one else talking about this? And it felt kind of interesting because so many people wanted to talk about it as this, like focus more on the non-dual aspect. Like that's the really interesting part of this, which it's interesting.
Yeah.
Or the psychological component. And I would say that now that I know your work pretty well and thinking about our work, I would say that we're like somewhere on the spectrum between psychology and energy. We're probably like 80-20 energy and psychology. We still help people with some tools for the psychology perspective. Like I think presenting options for people to engage with certain tools that may be helpful is one thing. It's a lot different than saying the way you need to interpret this experience is through my matrix, and here's the matrix. And unless you see it my way, you don't get it. Like there's lots of ways to get this experience. And when you're open, it's super fun because you can work with people from religions, and like you can work with Christians and Muslims and Jewish folks or whatever. And that's super interesting because then you get to see it through their spectrum.
Yeah.
Or you get it through atheists, or you work through all these different layers, and you can be a blank canvas for people, which is ultimately allows them to express the experience in whatever way makes the most sense to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that goes a long way to this other issue that you mentioned of the trust and comfort with the facilitator and with the entire context. That is so important, because anyone who's working with a large 5-MeO dose, that you really do feel like you're putting your life into somebody else's hands. And so you want that to be somebody that you feel that you have a good rapport with, that you can have a conversation with, that you can ask questions around. Like going back to the drive-by 5-MeO shamanism, one of the biggest complaints that came out of that sort of context was, well, these folks, they're not available for a conversation, and I don't feel that I have access to them, and I'm not comfortable. I can't bring my concerns or questions to people who are operating this way. So providing, like having that sort of retreat context of you're staying here, you're getting to know these people, you're living with them, you're trusting them, they're trusting you, that it just provides such a level of support, because that, as we know, like a big part of the 5-MeO experience can be this radical sense of being fundamentally and like cosmically alone. Because that is, when we go into the non-dual, like, guess what? There really is only one. Mm-hmm. So having that sense of, okay, whoa, I'm fundamentally alone, but actually there's other embodied versions of the universal self that I can interact with, that I can trust, and that I feel that I can put my life in their hands. We need a strong, supportive, nurturing environment for like good facilitation of 5-MeO.
Agreed. And I think what we hear over and over again from people who have had more of the drive-by 5 experience is when they come to see us and come through our process, they'll say that this was totally different than what I've experienced before. I didn't realize this medicine could do that. I didn't understand it. And we had one guy from New Zealand, like fly all the way from New Zealand, and he had worked with 5-MeO 7 times before coming to see us. And he said the same thing. He said, oh, I had an instinct that this is what I was trying to do, but it never was this. And now I get it. And now I've had like this experience finally went there. And it is, in some ways it can be complex, but the simple part is that it's really about building trust and context with the person for a period of time. And we take so many steps to do that in building a relationship, in building trust with the person. We think of every single touch point, from our website to the first email they get, from the first conversation we have. All those steps are part of a process to build trust with that person, so that when they finally take that high dose of 5-MeO DMT, somewhere super deep in their system, they go, I can do this, and I have the support I need. I can trust these people. And hopefully we've done enough context building with them that they trust themselves on a level that they didn't previous as well. Like they feel like they have the right training is the wrong word, but the right preparation for it. And even the aspects afterwards. So we offer every guest 2 weeks minimum of on-call support should they need it. And we kind of call it a 2-week window, but if somebody is really struggling and a month out, they can always reach out to us and we will always find time for a phone call with them. And so that's not only I think just harm reduction and safety best practices and whatnot, but somewhere in their psyche when they're about to take that hit, know that they have that on the other end. And that allows them to go deeper. That allows the psyche to say, okay, no matter what comes up here, these guys are going to take care of me or make sure that I have support coming out the other end. And that's felt like a really important aspect of our work. It's kind of one of the main limiting factors in terms of who and how many people we can serve, which is totally fine. But it feels like a really important aspect of our work is that we're not going to ghost you after this experience. Now, we may not be able to, we don't provide ongoing therapeutic support directly necessarily like you do, for instance. And we have a lot of people we refer for that, but we will support you in the acute integration phase. We will make sure that you get pointed to the right resources and we will pick up the phone. We will talk to you and we will provide context and support in any way we can. And that feels really important.
Yeah. And I'm sure that is really important to the clients as well, because even if they don't make use of that, as you say, just knowing that the offer is there, that goes a long way. And again, it's just a huge difference from sort of the drive-by approach where just so many people were left hanging and not knowing where to turn or who to talk to or how to get help. And resources are really, really limited. And even now, here we are in 2025, there's still not a lot of resources around 5-MeO that are available out there.
There's a lot of information, but very little I would ever want people to point people towards, because so much of it is just missing the nuance that we've been discussing this whole time in this conversation. There's very few people, seems like to me, having this type of depth of understanding of the medicine. There's definitely people out there, but not a ton of information. And you're sifting through a lot of bad information to get to it.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think the other aspect, I think that's a huge element besides the on-call support. Like you say, most people don't end up needing that acute emergency sort of on-call support. But we, also just having community calls. We have, once you've gone through our process, you can come to our community calls for life and you can drop into them. We connect our community with other members from our community quite often to create more peer-to-peer support. We do integration calls as a group, like the group integration calls at the 2 and 4 week point. So there's all these other elements, plus, the integration library and all this other stuff we've put together. We're just really leaning into and continuing to lean into that post-care piece, because I think that's actually where the biggest lift is and the biggest potential is.
Yeah, because that actually goes back to sort of this profound irony of the 5-MeO experience, where you can't really have an experience that feels more unitary in nature, where, wow, I really am one with everything, yet that experience is also profoundly isolating for so many people, because it's I don't know who I can talk to about this experience and that people are going to be able to relate to it. So it's this weird paradox where we go through this sense of all sense of separation has been dissolved, but now as the individual that I am, I feel very alone. And so here's where having community, having a space where people can reconnect with others who have been through the experience and be able to share and talk about it, it's very nurturing and supporting for people. And so I'm very happy to hear that that's part of what you guys provide. And you're really looking at it as, again, it's a process. It's not just about, did you get a big hit? Did you blow your mind? Cool. But it's the whole process of that. Hopefully, ideally, we're working with 5-MeO to actually not only improve people's lives, but maybe potentially change the world. And to do that, we need to have good community and communication around what is possible with this, and giving people opportunity to share their experiences and share how things are moving for them.
Yeah, big time. It's so interesting how, no matter what you tell people about it being a process, and we're really heavy on that term, and we think of it, we call it the Enfold process. And this is a process. And throughout the week, we're like reminding people, this is a multi-month process. We're, all that, we keep saying that over and over again. Despite that, somewhere our minds are very good at simplifying things down to, I signed up for that big hit of 5-MeO I'm getting on in the middle of this week, And it's interesting because a lot of people's biggest moments and epiphanies and some of the bigger energy releases also happen the night after the next day, our integration day. Yeah. We don't serve any medicine on the integration day, but we take people through a couple of different ceremonies and process steps. And it's always a really underestimated day, and how it's a very powerful day for people, because oftentimes that's when things start to pop or things start to come to light that may have been missed in the actual high dose ceremony, And the high dose ceremony is going to just start revealing itself at that point, for that time for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about the trajectory over, say, the 5 days. And I'm very interested, for when did you guys start incorporating injections into the mix?
Yeah, and the intramuscular?
Yeah.
So we started working on our intramuscular process probably almost 3 years ago. We didn't serve it to a client or a guest for almost 2 years, mostly because, and I think this is really overlooked as people start to do more intramuscular, that the purity of the material, like the purity of the 5-MeO, has to be exceptionally high, and otherwise you're just kind of rolling the dice in terms of potential physiological risk. So it took quite a while to secure a lab partner that we felt could consistently produce a very, very high quality, what I think might be the highest quality 5-MeO DMT in the world, amongst it anyway. And so we took a while to do that, and also work through the steps of how do you prepare the solution in with all the right steps in place to make sure it's super clean and all of that kind of stuff. So there's kind of like the technical aspect of developing the protocol. And then the other aspect was testing it out, trying different doses, understanding. The hardest thing about serving 5-MeO is testing 5-MeO is a beast, man. It's hard, right? Like, as I'm sure you've had so many years of fucking around and trying things, and it's such a big medicine. Like it's such a wild thing to try and balance. So that took a while too, to try different dose ranges and understand how intramuscular differed from vaporized, because they have very different profiles. Yeah. And so what's interesting in the process is that when we first worked with intramuscular, our impression was, we are going to slowly move towards intramuscular, and then we are going to transition away from vaporized because it's quote unquote better, or it's just this is it. And we started rolling out so our first rollouts were in private sessions with people where we had them for a few days. We do these private sessions with people when they want and they'll come see us for like 2 or 3 days, and we'll work either as a solo or a couple or something like that. And we started doing 2 days of 5-MeO, one with intramuscular on the first day and then vaporized on the second day. But what we found is that the intramuscular at high doses for novices or for people who are new to this medicine, it actually was just like really hard, kind of intolerable for them. I watched your video. You had those folks come and you did it on right here in your living room floor there. And like, I forget, you did, I think 16 or 18 milligrams, something like that.
In between those 17.
You did 17. Okay. Yeah. And I of all of our testing, I did 18 milligrams. So, same thing, as a testing round. And it was one of the best and most informative and powerful 5 experiences I've ever had, maybe still to this date. That was a couple of years ago. But I could see how, like, for people who are new to this medicine, it was almost like, I don't know, it felt like it was forever, and it was amazing. And I could have gone longer, but I realized the people we were with, like, we'd been testing all day and people needed to eat dinner. And I kind of like pulled the ripcord somehow and kind of got out of it. But all to say, this is a long-winded way of saying basically when we started, we thought we're going to switch to intramuscular. What we found is that it actually wasn't as tolerable as we thought. And so we rolled back that a bit. We started trying to combine, and what we've landed on now are our protocol now, which I believe is unique, but I'm not sure if anyone else is doing this, is that we'll administer the intramuscular dose, typically in a mid-range sort of number, and then we'll administer a large vaporized dose right after that. And so the intramuscular dose takes 3 to 5 minutes onset. In that window, we're then serving a high dose vaporized hit. And so what people are getting is the peak experience of the vaporized. And then as that starts to metabolize, like in the sort of few minutes as that metabolizing, the intramuscular dose is just setting in, and then it's leveling off, and you're getting this long, say 30 to 45 minute plateau to work with the medicine and like have a much more therapeutic experience. And so we combine those two, because the other thing we found is that intramuscular doesn't deliver the same payload velocity as vaporized, right? Where vaporized does something where it just cuts into the nervous system. Is like more like a stick of dynamite rather than a set of small disruptions, where intramuscular just doesn't do the same thing. And so I think that each application has its merits and its benefits, and that blending them actually then creates this really incredible experience.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you've shared all this information, because the whole injection approach is relatively new in the 5-MeO world. And I always like to emphasize this is only something that is possible with very pure 5-MeO DMT. No one should be trying to inject toad secretions into themselves. Please don't ever do that.
That's super unsafe.
Yeah, we only want to use pure 5-MeO. So it's only accessible through the pure molecule. Sorry, just to pause on that, just most medicine, most 5-MeO that you're buying is probably in the range of 90 to 95% purity. If you're lucky, if it's good, and that's not high enough purity, you do not want to be injecting 92%, 95% purity. There's a 5% range in there that could be a whole bunch of other things. It's really unsafe. The other thing to note is that it's HCl. It's not free base.
Right. So just because I feel like there's too many people who are going to be like, let's buy some needles on the internet.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Sorry. Keep going.
But yes, it's having had my own experience. I've had a lot of people ask, and often what people are asking is like, well, what do you think is better? And where do you think I should start? And so I like that you're kind of addressing this and what you've shared here. That what I have shared with people is like, well, for me, coming with lots of experience, the 17 milligram injection was awesome. And I loved it. I really, really loved it. So, but I don't think I would ever start someone there, because I do know how to trust and let go within the experience. And this is where I think that vaporizing is particularly important, because I always like to say, look, the ego is incredibly resilient. And that's not a judgment around like, oh, your ego's too big or whatever. It's like, no, egos are resilient. It actually takes a lot of energy to completely override it. And when we're working with a longer, slower modality, there's always plenty of time for the ego to be like, whoa, what do I do with this? And so there really is value. And I like to call it the pulling the cosmic rug out from underneath the ego that we get with vaporizing, that it paradoxically makes the experience easier for people, because the ego just says, fuck it, I'm letting go. So I like that you're kind of combining those modalities, and I think that that's an important awareness, that even though we as experienced 5-MeO users might think like, yeah, like the injection is really awesome and it's such a way to go, that it might not really be the best place to start people at. And so I like this idea of kind of using a mid-range dose and then getting that booster through the vaporizer and still getting a very full experience. But we always want to address the question of how are we going to deal with the ego through this experience, through this highly energized experience. And so working in a modality that maximizes the potential that someone really can let go and also receive benefits. I think it's just wise to put the emphasis there. So I like to hear how you're working this. And I will say that, I've worked with some people who have gone to you guys there at Enfold, and I've gotten to watch the videos. So I've seen these different progressions of okay, there's the injection, here's the vaporizer, and you can watch. And I really enjoy being able to watch people's videos because I think that there's so much you can read from how people are reacting, what's going on with their bodies, how they're breathing, how they're moving, what kind of sounds they're making. So I find it very useful as an integration coach to be able to see that. So thank you for allowing your clients to record and share.
Yeah.
But from what I've seen, I've been like, yeah, this looks really good.
It's honestly, the combination is, so yeah, we kind of discovered the challenges with intramuscular because we thought it was going to work that with private clients that they would come and we would do intramuscular the first day, which would be a more therapeutic type working with your stuff kind of experience. And then the next day we would do vaporized, which would be more of a energetic clearing experience. So that was kind of the thinking at the time. But what we found is, I think twice in a row, we had clients who were like, we would do the intramuscular and the next day they'd be like, I don't know if I can go again. Like, I don't know if I can do that. And we just realized that the tolerability was going to be a challenge there. But a couple of things that are interesting. One is that the other thing a lot of what people are doing is the titrating, which is kind of a classic approach of, when we're talking about vaporized, small, medium, large dose, which I think on one hand makes a lot of sense in that if you're kind of coming in cold, there's something to be said about warming up the nervous system and not the jarring nature of 5-MeO potentially, especially if it's your first time. Like, there's something to be said about that. However, on the flip side of that, like you said, dropping somebody straight into the high dose, dissolving of full dissolution of the ego is in some ways easier and potentially more productive. Like, there's something, so there's this balancing act of, well, we don't want to traumatize the nervous system and we don't want to kind of shock somebody too much because that has some downstream effects that may or may not be productive. But there's also something really nice about just dropping straight in. It's kind of like, I don't know what the analogy would be, but there's that kind of balance. And so one thing we've also done now is that when people, because we have more days with people, when they arrive on the first day, our first ceremony is working at very low doses. We create our own vape pens, and they're essentially like, very low dose. And over the course of an hour or so, we do multiple low range doses where people can self-administer. It's guided and it's timed and it's a guided meditation and all of that. But people can build some safety and trust with the medicine in a very low dose setting and also start to prime the nervous system, start to relax into the medicine, build some safety with it. We call it meet the medicine. And so we sort of answer the first challenge of how do you not shock the nervous system by doing that on the first day. And then 2 days later, then we drop in with high dose and we just go straight in.
Yeah. I'm curious in terms of your clientele, have you, in the years that you guys have been working, have you noticed any particular shifts in terms of demographics? And also, like you mentioned, like this guy coming from New Zealand, like experienced it 7 times before. What would you say is the percentage of people who have prior experience with 5-MeO versus people who are just coming in? And again, any kind of shifts you've seen? And that if you do get somebody who has a lot of prior experience, are you still doing the meet the medicine? Or if somebody says, hey, look, Steve, I've done it 10 times. Can we go to the big dose? Where do you stand on that? So that's kind of a collection of questions, but that's just kind of what all popped into my mind as you were sharing that.
Yeah, interesting. I would say that people are more and more, well, how do I answer this? So first of all, the typical person that comes to see us is 45 to 75, and often in this sort of 50s, 60s age range. They are not psychonauts typically. They are people who are looking to improve the quality of their life, right? And we have a lot of our folks come through referral. So a lot of people have heard about us, heard about how we work, heard about that from a friend or somebody they trust in their network. And so that's always great because they have a bit of a a primer. I would say that people are more aware of 5-MeO-DMT today than they were 5-6 years ago when we started, for sure.
Yeah.
So I would say like a few years ago, we would have people who had heard about us, who heard about the impact of our work, wanted to sign up, but didn't even know what 5-MeO was. They didn't necessarily almost care. It was kind of like, I just want to come do what you're doing. And we would explain to them, we would have to walk back because they said it's mushrooms or something, right? And it's like, no, it's definitely not. But so I'd say like the market is becoming more educated on some level, at least at a basic level. And so that's nice. But it's people from all walks of life from all over the world now, which is super interesting. We're starting to see more folks from Europe, Asia, New Zealand, Australia. We've had somebody from pretty much every continent this past year, from Africa, from South America, I guess not the Antarctic or whatever, but so it's a pretty wide range of folks. I'd say slightly more psychedelic aware. There's a bit more information out there. And I don't know. And I would say that's the main thing that shifted is the level of awareness that people have of 5-MeO-DMT in particular, that they're seeking out 5-MeO-DMT. Sometimes quite naively, sometimes with more informed reason for why they're seeking this medicine. Yeah. And I would say also that a lot of our demographic are folks that have done lots of therapy, have done lots of, maybe they've been to a number of psychedelic retreats with mushrooms or MDMA or sort of those type, or ayahuasca. And they've felt like they've got a much clearer understanding of their psyche or their psychology, but they haven't actually moved the needle because that all the energy work that we've talked about in this conversation hasn't happened yet. Yeah. And so they've heard that people who come to this actually get that movement, and that's what they're seeking. They're like, I can armchair psychology myself, and I understand all the reasons why I am this way, but I don't know how to shift the energy and actually change how I feel. And that's what most people are seeking when they come to see us. And then in terms of your second question around meet the medicine or the approach when people have experience with 5, what's really interesting is that most people have worked with 5 in high dose, but doing very low dose work is a totally different experience and really beautiful. And so it's not necessarily meeting the medicine, but it's meeting the medicine from a different perspective. And we're pretty adamant about our process is our process, and we run it. It's a set of steps we've developed over 6 years. It works. It feels like a really safe approach. And so that's what you're signing up for, unless you do a private with us, and then we'll adapt and we can design something more custom to you. But the meet the medicine actually for experienced folks is just as impactful. It's just different. Once you've worked with 5, you enter into the medicine more easily, and so it's a deeper experience. But sitting in that low dose space, especially because it kind of it builds over the course of the hour as you relax more into it, as there's some compounding effects, it's a totally different way to access 5, and it's really beautiful. So I don't know, people really enjoy it even if they've experienced 5-MeO many times.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very interesting question because this is another one that people often ask me, like, what do you recommend, starting slow and working your way up or just diving in? I tend towards the just go for it approach. But then I always put in the corollary that I say, in my experience, working with low doses of 5 just becomes way more effective once you've had that full release experience, because it's, as you say, that you learn, I can trust, I can relax, I can expand in this. So yep. I like to promote that idea that it can actually be very, very effective as a tool when you know how to work with it. And this is just a place where I've seen, like when people are just getting introduced to 5 for the first time, that it's not at all uncommon for people to say, well, the low dose, I was just uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do, right? That's because the ego is always like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do?
Yeah.
But, I think even working with it in this way that you're describing of like, okay, we're going to gradually, let's go a little deeper, that it can accumulate over time. And as long as people are really learning how to relax and expand within that I could see it could be very fruitful for people.
Yeah, I can see both sides too. Because there is something about just dropping straight into the deep deep end, we found that, this seems to work really well. We also, the second day, we do a totally different type of ceremony. And so it's like all these steps into the high dose work. But when we get to the high dose work, we're going to drop as deep as we can right away, basically. And it's interesting because when we used to do the titrating approach, when we only had one ceremony, when our intensives were shorter, and we would always titrate in, but a lot of people get pretty stuck in those low mid-range doses because the medicine is strong and you're getting into that huge battle of the ego, and it can be really tricky for first timers, or even, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be a first timer. It just be really tricky, period.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I'm so grateful that you had time to have this conversation today. I would love to just keep talking with you. I think that there's so much that we could continue to explore here together. I do need to jump in the car and go drive and pick up my son from school. So
beautiful.
I have reached my time limit, but I just really appreciate the time that you've made today to have this conversation. And I would just also want to say that, over the recent years, I've definitely pointed a number of people in your direction, and I've also received a number of people for integration who have come through the work that you guys doing at Enfold. And I would just say, and it's not like I'm trying to get you clients or anything like that, but I've only heard very positive responses from everyone that I have dealt with, that you guys have worked with. I feel that you are really working with integrity, and again, everything that I've heard in the conversation today just kind of reinforces that. Like, yeah, I like the way that Steve is going about this. I like what I hear about Enfold. So just thank you for doing this work and doing it with integrity, and for being open to sharing all about it here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast, and share of yourself and your practice.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin, and thanks for all the work that you do. And it's nice to know that a lot of our clients have worked with you as well, and we're going to continue to refer you as well, because you're amazing at what you do. And honestly, this has been one of the best this is probably the most sophisticated conversation I've ever had on a podcast about this medicine. So it's really enjoyable. I'd love to keep up the conversation for sure.
Awesome. Well, let's
stay
connected, Steve.